Well, welcome. It's just 13 days until Christmas and only 8 until episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, is released. And yesterday I posted a video about why I love Rey's character. And one thing that I need to address for sure is a lot of the debate that is revolved around Rey's character being overpowered, or Mary Sue. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that topic and just go through some perspective that I have regarding those attributes. And if you go back to the original definition of Mary Sue that comes from the Star Trek lore, then that was famously set up. You can go research that. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but that has evolved a bit over time, and it's become an indicator of bad story writing. And a lot of people use that to say you want to avoid adding a character that would meet those attributes, male or female, because it takes away from character building and the character arcs that can be established. So I just wanted to work through some of the complaints that I hear on a regular basis and some of my own perspective, and just taking it sort of the order that it comes to us as we see it in the movies. The first complaint is about Rey's piloting the Millennium Falcon, her familiarity with the Millennium Falcon and being able to do so much right out of the gate. And I'll address this a couple of ways. First of all, concerning her pilot skills as a whole, we see her when she first gets in the Falcon and tries to fly it. There's a bit of clunkiness involved. She kind of crashes into some of the structures around, bounces it off the ground a couple of times, and even once she gets up, she kind of skirts the ground again a little bit later. So it doesn't start off perfectly from the get-go. Now, she does learn those skills very, very quickly. We could make an argument there that she learns how to fly that way too quick. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. However, if we go back and we look, go back to the movie Solo and look at the first time Han actually flew the Falcon for the first time. Now, granted, Han was already a trained pilot at that point and an established pilot at that point. But he flies the Falcon tremendously well. And some of the arguments I've seen says that she flies it better than Han ever has. And I would just challenge you to go watch that movie and see how Han flies the Falcon, and see that Rey. I don't think you can hold that to be a valid argument. She certainly flies it very, very well. But I wouldn't say she flies it better than Han ever has, considering his first flight was quite remarkable and becomes something he becomes proud of and quotes often throughout his career afterwards. So there's that aspect. The second one I would bring up concerning piloting skills and force sensitives as a whole is if we go back to Anakin and the Phantom Menace. Here's approximately 8-year-old kid who's flying pod racers. Now, pod racers are a little bit different than the Falcon for sure, but at the same time, we've got an 8-year-old competing against some of the most successful pod racing pilots in the galaxy. And if you read into extended lore, humans as a whole, as a species, are not able to compete very effectively with pod racers due to the reflexes needed and the skill level. And so you've got very established pilots throughout the galaxy, human pilots who have been trained and they've been flying for their entire careers, who are not able to successfully fly a pod racer at the same skill level we see an 8-year-old. And you could argue, well, Anakin's been flying those for years. I would say yes, which furthers my argument that if an 8-year-old has been flying those for years, when did he start? 5, 6, 4? And think about a 5-year-old, somebody who's in kindergarten, or maybe a preschooler, and allowing them to pilot a car, or to drive a car, or pilot an airplane. That would be ridiculous. And for them to be able to do that solo on their own, or to be able to build a vehicle, a car, or build anything of technical skill. Yet we see Anakin here at 8 years old has built his own pod racer. Now again, he's a slave. He's been working with parts. He's very familiar with this. But he's 8. Let's not overlook that. An 8-year-old who is quite competent to build a complex vehicle that can compete with some of the best pod racers in the galaxy. You look at the pod racer itself. That vehicle, you figure there are engineers, mechanics that have built these other pod racers that have worked a lifetime for those skills, and yet an 8-year-old, through his condition of slavery, was able to build a pod racer that competes at that level or beyond. In fact, in just Anakin's ability to problem solve on the fly, be able to correct mechanical issues on the fly, and be able to successfully compete in that pod race is quite remarkable. And I get the argument that he's been doing this for some time, but I'll back that up again by saying how many preschoolers or kindergartners can start their career in NASCAR racing, for example? Who could do that at 5? And the argument is, well, he's the chosen one. He is a force sensitive. Absolutely. And that's exactly my point. He's a force sensitive, very powerful with force. He's attracted all these midichlorians. Now that's, I get what those are about, and it just shows his aptitude to use the force. And there's some inherent skills that people have as force sensitive, as far as being able to have heightened reflexes. That's what allows them to use lightsabers so effectively. That allows them to pilot so effectively, because their reflexes are honed and much faster. They also have this pre-sight that we see, that's sort of an inherent thing, so they can see things before they happen. And these are things that aren't necessarily trained, they're inherent. And when we see Rey, much older than 8, right? She's at least 10 years older, 12, 13 years older than Anakin was in The Phantom Menace. She has been working with Unkar Plutt. She mentions that she's familiar with the changes that Plutt has made to the Falcon, which means that she's been working in and around that area. She has been scavenging parts, much like Anakin as a slave boy was working with parts. So I think those stories are similar enough. We don't see all of that happening. We see her traded to Unkar Plutt. We hear her talk later about the changes that Plutt had made. She learned those things from the time that she served as an indentured servant, right, or part of the human trafficking that she was sold into. And so she was a slave in a sense as well, and she was working with those parts. She was scavenging parts, and it's not at all unreasonable to think that somebody who's 10, 12 years senior to Anakin might have the same or even more skills as far as piloting and as far as mechanical work is concerned. So I think it's hard to say that Rey is much different than we would see other force sensitives at the age that she is, especially concerning piloting and mechanical skills. It's not to say that she isn't overpowered, or that she is somehow not meet some of the qualifications we see in a Mary Sue or a Gary Stu, but I'm to say that there's a precedent that's been set, and she's not at all unlike other characters that we've seen within the universe, within the franchise. And in fact, some of the others could be argued that their case is even more enhanced than Rey's in those aspects. So the second, and I kind of talked about this just a little bit, is her skills with the lightsaber. Well, she picked up this lightsaber, and she defeated Kylo Ren, who has been trained for all these years and who is a student. He's one of the strongest Force users in the galaxy, and he has a long history of being trained through Luke Skywalker, and then on with in Luke's academy before he separated there, and he also he trained under Snoke, and that Kylo should be far more advanced in mastery of the lightsaber than Rey, and it shouldn't even be close. And again, I'd say, well, sure, all of that makes total sense, and I wouldn't argue that a bit. I just want to bring up a couple points to say that handling and using a lightsaber is not a specific skill to a Jedi. We see lots of examples, starting all the way back with The Empire Strikes Back, and Han, who is not a Jedi, is not a Force sensitive, to our knowledge at all, and he is able to wield it and effectively use it as a tool. Again, he's not fighting with it. He doesn't have the reflexes, which ties into why Force sensitives are far more effective at a lightsaber. The second one I would say is go back to A New Hope, when Luke first touches the lightsaber in Obi-Wan's hut on Tatooine. And Obi-Wan hands him that lightsaber. He turns it on, and he's able to use it in some basic forms immediately. He's had no training to that point, but he can certainly wield it. He can use it, and within just a very short time, perhaps just a few minutes of training, or maybe an hour or two of training, he's already deflecting some blaster bolts with it. He's beginning to get some proficiency with it. And we also see that there's no history necessarily with Luke with melee weapons. He's not necessarily been raised to be combat efficient, to fight hand to hand or anything like that. But yet he's able to handle that thing fairly quickly. On the other hand, we have Rey, who was raised in the desert, very much scavenging for herself, and we see that she's already effective with melee weapon, that staff she carries. And I get the staff is nothing like a lightsaber. They're not even close. Sure, I get that. But the point is that she is used to some sort of combat, fighting with her hands, her feet, her body, and with some tools, melee weapons. We don't know what other weapons that she has used other than that staff, but I would certainly think that there were some other things that she could, wield in her hands. The point being that she has some fighting background just in defending herself and surviving. She also has some in proficiency with that staff, which is completely understandable. I don't think anybody argues that she shouldn't be able to defend herself in the way that she did in The Force Awakens there at the beginning of the movie. So when she first picks up the lightsaber, it's not at all unusual to think that she couldn't wield it as much as Luke did when he first held it, or that Han used it as a tool, or even as Finn did. And I get Finn probably had far more extensive combat training with all kinds of weapons as a stormtrooper. But it would be reasonable to think that Rey might have ability to handle the weapon as a whole. That's my only point. She can handle it, and she would have some familiarity with some sort of combat experience, dodging and moving and those kind of things, just because she had been on her own for so long. So handling the lightsaber as a whole, and when we see her in that first combat on Starkiller Base, when and I mentioned this yesterday, when Kylo first goes into combat with her with that lightsaber, he is dominating her very, very effectively, and she's making very ineffective jabs and swipes with the lightsaber that are no threat at all to him. She's not like a master lightsaber wielder, right? She's not going to compete at all with the folks who are renowned at lightsaber skills. So she's not even close to that, right? So she's ineffective in her lightsaber technique, in her ability to use it. And then, as I discussed yesterday, when she does overpower Kylo, it's in a different mindset. Kylo at that point has decided he wants to recruit her, train her, mentor her, and it's after he had already backed her against the cliff and dominated. So does she gain those powers a bit too quickly? Perhaps, yes, as just as a general character, but as a force sensitive, does she already have enhanced reflexes? Does she already have this foresight ability that's sort of intuitive to a force user? I think so. And it's not at all unlike what we saw in Anakin in The Phantom Menace when he was flying those pod racers. So it would be completely reasonable to think that most, if not all, force sensitives have enhanced reflexes, and they have enhanced foresight. Now, does that stand up against Kylo Ren's years of training and mastery? Not at all. Not at all. But remember, he wasn't trying to defeat her at the point when she pushed him back. He was just trying to parlay and defend himself, and didn't want to inflict damage on her. Plus, he has already been wounded. He's lost a good bit of blood. He still has that metal quarrel in his gut, and he's been injured by Finn previously. So it might be more of a commentary about what Kylo could have done versus what he did do, versus Rey just being some sort of lightsaber master, which she clearly is not. And we continue that on into The Last Jedi, when she is going to melee combat with Luke at the end of their training on Octo. She whacks him with her staff and knocks him down. He gets up, avoids a swipe she makes at him, pulls an antenna to himself, and then battles her one-handedly, one hand behind his back, battles her with that antenna and her preferred weapon of choice, that staff, effectively disarming her. He grabs the staff and tosses it aside. Completely owned her in that combat. So there's no indication at all that Rey's fighting technique, her ability with a staff or any other weapon, is superior to other characters that we see. In fact, it's far less than her skills are far lower than those. She does, at the end of Last Jedi, pull that lightsaber to herself, and Luke falls back, giving an apparent victory over Luke, which is another item that people complain about. But at the same time, she never furthered that, nor did he. He didn't try to defend himself. He slipped and fell. She didn't knock him down. And people can argue all they want about how Luke shouldn't have been that easily tripped with his force abilities, his training, his skills. That was more, again, a reflection of perhaps who Luke was at that point than it is about Rey. Again, I don't think that Rey beat either Kylo or Luke as far as a duel. We clearly see that Luke overpowers Rey easily in a duel, antenna against staff, and we see that Kylo easily outdueled her when he was combating her. So both those cases, I don't think that she has shown some advanced skills with a lightsaber. Her other force skills, and the most objectionable from The Force Awakens would be the mind reading technique. Again, the argument of her being overpowered, or a Mary Sue, is that she learns that with no training at all. The mind probe that Kylo does to her somehow transfers his training to her. We see in the book extended description of that scene. And people can argue about that not being right, and that being evidence that it's poor character writing and just transferring those skills to her. Again, I'm not going to argue against that at all. That's true. She does acquire that far too easily. But on the other hand, it is explained, and I would again argue that there are examples in the extended universe now in Legends of people who did far more with far less. So wouldn't say that it's uncharacteristic, but it certainly does qualify as an overpowered moment, as perhaps a Mary Sue kind of moment there. But you think about the other skills that she has not demonstrated because she's had no training at all. And that's an argument that a lot of people say, well, she's had no training, and look, she's the best Jedi ever. I'm like, no, that's not true at all. Luke has already been deflecting lights, some blaster bolt stuff from the training droid. Rey has not deflected anything with a lightsaber to this point. She doesn't have the skill. She's not been trained to do that at all. There's lots of other Force skills that she's not demonstrated that Luke did through the course of his movies. She hasn't used the Force to help guide her actions in any way. She's used it for that enhanced reflexes, but not in the same way that Luke had with the training that he had, nor the ability that Kylo did with the training he had. So yes, she's untrained, and it shows, I would say. One of the other points are that she's had no significant failures, no adversity. She just going through everything works out her way. There's no consequences for the mistakes that she does make, and so on. And that's a sign of a Mary Sue. Again, very little of that is something that you could argue against. However, I would point out that there are quite a few failures that she has, and quite a few adversities that she's faced that we've seen that's consistent with the franchise. So I've mentioned that she was sold into human trafficking when the parents dropped her off and sold her to Unkar Plutt for some gambling money, right, or whatever the case might be, drinking money. So that's called human trafficking. When you sell your child for money, that's human trafficking. She is sold into human trafficking, and she lives her entire life that way. Compare that to Anakin, who was a slave, but lived with his mother and was generally well cared for, and had a slave master, Watto, who wasn't necessarily all that bad, right? He let Anakin fly pod racers. He let Anakin have these projects on the side. Anakin had friends. Anakin had his mother. And yeah, they're slaves. That doesn't excuse any of that. Slavery is bad in all cases, all forms, throughout the galaxy. And we see it over and over within Star Wars, slavery being used. And it's never really effectively been confronted yet. The Jedi largely just look the other way. We see that even in The Phantom Menace. So, but Anakin then is picked up at a young age and then mentored, tutored with the Jedi, specifically with Obi-Wan, for the rest of his adolescence. We see Luke was raised with his aunt and uncle all the way through adolescence to adulthood. And he had adversity in his younger life, but we compare that to Rey, who was put into human trafficking, had to scavenge and work for Unkar Plutt, who largely did not give her the same sort of benefits that we saw Anakin have with Watto. And then she had to largely scavenge for her food, for her well-being, for her survival. She had to learn some fighting techniques and those things just to survive. So at the point we meet Rey, she's already gone through a great deal of adversity to get where she is. And we have to take that into account. And then later we see many things don't necessarily go her way. When she first fights Kylo on Starkiller Base, she's firing that blaster. It reminds me of the scene of Wendy in The Shining when she's swinging the ball bat at Jack Nicholson, right? So when she's doing that, it's very ineffective. She's crying, she's emotional, she's kind of breaking down, and we see that same sort of behavior when Rey is going through the woods and firing at Kylo kind of ineffectively, wildly. She's very emotional, she's crying, kind of breaking down. That's certainly not something that is, a characteristic of somebody who is perfect, right? She's got some stability issues there. Later, she gets force frozen, taken into captivity, and she can't do anything about it. Certainly, those have some. Those are adversities. Now, is there any long-lasting consequences? I guess it sort of depends on what you qualify, right? It goes person to person. You know, Anakin and Luke lost an arm or a hand, and Rey hasn't lost an arm or a hand. She got a scratch. So does that mean that she doesn't have the same sort of loss? I think it becomes a bit cliche. Like if somebody doesn't lose a hand, then it doesn't count. So I would. I mean, I might give you that, but at the same point, it's a little far-fetched to say there's been no consequences. She's lost quite a bit. She's gone through quite a bit of hardship through her life, and all the way through the Force Awakens until the very end, she's largely kind of fought her way through. Nothing's kind of given to her except if you want to say that training bit that she got from Kylo. So again, I'm kind of giving some of it to say, yeah, sure, there's some of this overpoweredness. There's this Mary Sue-ness that we see in her, but it's not unlike we see in other characters throughout the franchise. So if you carry on her struggle into The Last Jedi, and I mentioned this in the other, when Snoke gets her in that throne room, he tosses her around like a rag doll. She certainly doesn't overpower him at all. And is there a consequence to that? Well, no, and that's a matter of the story itself, it being that Kylo chooses to kill Snoke rather than her. Although that's not something she controlled, that was a story element. And if you want to then compare that again to Anakin and the Phantom Menace, you know, he gets in that starfighter and he's told, stay there, right? And so he stays there, but then it goes on autopilot. He goes through. He's untouched as he goes through the space battle. He's untouched as that ship goes into the blockade ship, and he then destroys that ship, makes it out with without a scratch, and returns back completely unharmed, right? And there's no consequence at all for anything that happened to Anakin in that movie. And that was largely a big story plot that drove him through that with no consequence at all as an 8-year-old going through a space battle. And I'd say, well, sure, has Rey had some of these story plot armor, if you will? Oh, sure, absolutely. That's the case with most hero movies. In any movie that you want to watch that goes that way, there's always some plot armor that's sort of ridiculous. Even more so, I would say, in the Phantom Menace, but that's just me. And Rey isn't any different in that case. The last being that she makes friends far too easily. Look, she hit it off with Han and Leia right off the bat. Leia gives her a hug and just bypasses Chewie and all of this kind of thing. There's been some retconning that's happened outside as far as that specific scene with Leia. But again, I would say, well, let's go back to the Phantom Menace and take a look at Anakin, our chosen one. We happened to land on Tatooine. Why? Why are they there in the first place? Was it part of the plot to go to Tatooine to achieve something? Was there any kind of mission to go to Tatooine? No, it was happenstance. They happened to land on Tatooine, and then they happened to need to go get a part, and they went to they happened to run across him. And when they ran across him, he hits it off with Qui-Gon Jinn immediately before Qui-Gon knows too much about him. Before Qui-Gon does the blood test, there's some indicators that kind of get Qui-Gon's attention, but at the same time, he hits it off immediately with Qui-Gon, with Obi-Wan, with Jar Jar, if you will, and also with Amidala herself, right? So, Padme at the time. So, he hits it off immediately with all the main characters. And if you want to further that on, the second Palpatine sees him, he gets Palpatine's attention as well. So here, Anakin has had all of these things. Compare that to Rey when she first meets Finn. She whacks him, right? They battle. So it's not that she instantly has this friendship with Finn. She's got this adversarial kind of relationship, and she's constantly telling him, "Quit grabbing my hand," right? So, but they do end up coming together. So, but it's not this instant attraction. The second would be then with Han, and she does hit it off with him right off the bat. Han and Chewie take to her really quickly. No question. Same with Leia. But look what happens when she meets Luke. Right? Luke rejects her offhand. Says, "Get out of here. Why are you here?" He's angry that she's there. And throughout, even when he acquiesces and decides to train her, it's not like he brings her in and is trying to mentor her. He's again kind of has this adversarial kind of relationship with her. It's not one of acceptance. And at the point where he does decide, you know what, I'm going to do the right thing by her, he sees her doing the Force Skype with Kylo. He loses his temper, and they have this battle on Octo, and she leaves right afterwards. So she never does establish a relationship with Luke, the main character, that you would say is a Mary Sue kind of relationship with a lead character, where Anakin hits it off with all of them very, very easily. So when I look at Rey, and I look at this argument of her being a Mary Sue, yes, on many counts, she meets those qualifications, but also so do other characters. And I'd like to bring up just a little bit of Sabine Wren and Kanan Jarrus in Rebels. Sabine has no experience at all with that dark saber. And if you watch the episode where Kanan begins to train her with that dark saber, within minutes, does she goes from, wow, this is heavy and she can't even wield it, to being able to best the Jedi Master in hand-to-hand combat. She beats him, and that's a clear victory for Sabine. You could go on and say, well, there's an agenda. There's another woman defeating a man with very little training. Well, who am I to say no to that? But also say that that's precedence for what we see with Rey. And maybe there is a theme there, and we'll talk more about that in tomorrow's video. So if you'll come back, we'll talk about the political agenda that we have within Star Wars, and some of the complaints that people have had. I'd like to remind you, we've got Santa's mailbox back here. If you want to submit a question or a topic to be discussed, submit those. We'll put them in a mailbox and pull them out, and we'll discuss them in a future video. Until then, may the Force be with you, and Merry Christmas.